Well, let me, the topic that I was asked to talk about is, must be announced somewhere, is money, power, and world order, which doesn't leave out a lot. It's a daunting prospect. I'm not going to try to say anything really comprehensive about it. I'll pick up a few issues that seem to me major ones. I take it you'll understand that this is partial, oversimplified, overstated. I hope we can deal with some of those problems in the discussion period later on. As far as world order goes, well, let me pick up where Charlie left off. Sorry? Can't hear me? Can you hear me now? All right, I'll try to stay close to the mic. I'll pick up where Charlie left off on world order. The systems of world order that take shape, including the current one, and I agree with him that this is a kind of defining moment, these are not the results of natural law, certainly not historical or economic laws. They come from human decisions in human institutions, which can be made in different ways. This morning, as you may have noticed if you read the papers, Margaret Thatcher emerged from retirement. Her famous slogan was what she called TINA, there is no alternative. That's ideological claptrap. There's plenty of alternatives. The alternative that she preferred was one that was contrived and instituted in the interests of certain sectors of overwhelming power, and they're the ones who, not surprisingly, benefit from the arrangements that they instituted. Whether we choose to accept them or not is another question. This is also true of what are very misleadingly called markets. Markets, in whatever form they take, are also constructed, managed, designed in specific ways. In our particular system, and this goes back for hundreds of years, markets are typically double-edged. Market discipline is a great thing for the poor and the vulnerable, but for the rich and the powerful, they demand and receive protection from the nanny state. That's the way markets have always been, with very rare exceptions, and it's dramatically true in the United States. We call this free enterprise economy and so on. That's only very partially true. For one thing, it's largely managed internally to huge tyrannies called corporations, which are interlinked in all sorts of ways in strategic alliances and so on. But quite apart from that, if you have the power, you expect protection from the state. And that's not marginal. If you look over the dynamic sectors of the U.S. economy today, telecommunications, internet, computers, biotechnology, automation, run through it, and look into their history, you'll discover that virtually without exception, they were developed, designed, and paid for by the general public, at public expense. So cost is socialized, profit is privatized. Furthermore, risk is socialized. So the main function, you read that the IMF bails out countries when they get into trouble, but that's highly misleading. It doesn't bail out the countries. It bails out the lenders and the investors, makes sure they don't have to take a risk for their risky and therefore high yield investments, and the country pays for it. The poor of the country, so you take, say, Indonesia, the people who are paying to ensure that the lenders and investors get paid off are the poor people of the country who never borrowed the money in the first place, and by and large, quite often not only didn't gain from it, but even suffered from it. But they're the ones who pay, along with Western taxpayers who are expected to provide the free risk insurance. And this is true across the board. There was a year or two ago a major technical study by two European economists of the 100 leading transnational corporations in the world on the Fortune list, they found that every one of them had benefited substantially from state protection, that means taxpayer subsidy, and about 20 out of the 100 would not have survived as businesses if it hadn't been for public bailouts. Now, we're not talking about marginal facts. This is core elements of the economy. If you personalize it, you find it even more so. So no one preached more passionately about the marvels of the free market and the need to take responsibility for yourself and so on than Newt Gingrich, who also year after year brought home more federal subsidies to his rich constituents than anyone else and any other congressman in the country. His counterpart in the Senate, Trent Lott, House Senate Majority Leader, was described by the London Financial Times a little while ago, the major international business daily. He was described as the chief pork producer in Congress for his rich constituents. That's the way the system works. Market discipline is perfect for poor people in El Salvador or working mothers in the slums. They have to learn responsibility, but not the rich and the powerful. They have to be protected. That's the truth about neoliberalism. It's double-edged, and that goes back hundreds of years. That's a good part of the reason why the third world is the third world and the first world is the first world. You go back 200 years ago, they weren't very different. They diverged enormously, and there are a lot of reasons for that, but one substantial part of the reason is that the third world had market discipline rammed down their throats by force, whereas the first world, England, the United States, Germany, Japan, without exception, every developed country, had a powerful state initiative that protected and developed the economy, and that continues right till this moment. So that's what's called markets. They're designed in particular ways. Well, who makes these decisions? In the international arena, the decisions are made by states. But to borrow George Orwell's phrase, some states are more equal than others. The ones who are most equal are the ones called G7, the 7 rich industrial countries. So they have an overwhelming effect on state decisions. And of G7, the one that's far and away the most equal is, of course, the United States, which since the Second World War has had a position of overwhelming international power, no historical precedent to that, and of course has used it to design a world in the interests of powerful sectors within. Alongside the powerful states, there are the institutions that they've designed, the international financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, took over from GATT a couple of years ago. Those are institutions of global dominance, global control, which are themselves controlled by the rich countries and primarily by the United States, which once again has an overwhelming influence. The states themselves are not autonomous agents. They don't act as a degree of autonomy, but to a very large extent, as you'd expect, what they do reflects the internal distribution of power. So what is called U.S. policy is a reflection to a significant extent, a very significant extent, and always has been, of the distribution of power within the United States. And that's no secret either. That power is largely lodged, especially through the 20th century and increasingly today, in major collectivist concentrations of power, private, which are internally tyrannical, linked to one another, and control a substantial, huge part of the domestic and international economy. The corporate systems, the industrial and the financial institutions, which are increasingly transnational. The extent to which they control the international economy is growing and enormous. Just to give one index, and there are many, the sales of affiliates, foreign affiliates of transnationals, so affiliates of General Motors operating abroad and so on, the sales of affiliates of transnationals alone is considerably greater than total of world trade. In the last 25 years, this is a major and significant change, something without precedent in the history of industrial capitalism. There has been a huge explosion of financial institutions and financial capital, almost all speculative. Very little of it has anything to do with the real economy, maybe 5%. And that is an enormous flow, not, again, by decision of state actors and the powers within them. The flow is now estimated at about $1.5 trillion a day, very little of it productive. In fact, the speculative flow, about 95% of it is mostly destructive, not productive. The degree to which it's speculative is illustrated by the return time on investments. So, when capital flowing abroad and back, about 80% of it has a return time of less than a week, much of it less than a day, even hours and minutes. The scale is fantastic. The $1.5 trillion a day is over twice the total foreign exchange reserves of all states together, which means that has an overwhelming, they can easily overwhelm any government, in fact, any combination of governments. Well, all of that is highly concentrated, reflects an extraordinary degree of concentrated and interlinked power, and it determines to a substantial degree what state decisions are, and it does it in many ways. For one thing, the executive branch of the states is largely drawn from these institutions, so lawyers from corporate law firms and so on. Secondly, they virtually own Congress. The extent to which that's true, and it's increasing, again, just to illustrate, in the latest elections, the 1998 congressional elections, about roughly 95% of winning candidates outspent their opponents, which means if you had the money, you won. Where'd the money come from? Well, by about a ratio of 12 to 1, business outspent labor. Well, labor represents way more people. So you have a tremendous concentration of ability to buy candidates in the hands of a very small sector, namely the business world, same corporations that staff the executive. If you look at private contributions, figures that are available indicate that about 1/4% of the population provided 80% of the contributions. Again, that tells you who's buying the elections. The money isn't given for charity. It's given because you expect a return, and the return comes. The money incidentally goes to both parties. May vary a little bit one way or another, but the point is to buy them all. And you get a return. So in the 1996 election, for example, as Tom Ferguson, who's a very good political scientist here at UMass, has been working on these topics for many years, pointed out that the election was to a large extent bought at particularly toward the end, by the telecommunications industry, which poured a huge amount of money into it, enough to get Clinton elected, in fact. And they got something, namely the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which is a huge giveaway of public property, maybe on the order of $100 billion. It was so blatant an act of robbery that it offended a lot of conservative opinion, and got some publicity because of that. Bob Dole, who was running for president, condemned it bitterly as corporate welfare. He then had the facts of life explained to him, and he ended up backing it. There were never any hearings called on this huge giveaway, and there was no media coverage, because the public isn't supposed to know about these things. This is just the way your lives are controlled and organized. An even bigger giveaway, this one is incalculable, you don't know how to measure it in dollars, is the giveaway of the internet. That's very recent. 4 years ago, in fact. It was commercialized, handed over to private power. A year before that, in 1994, Bill Gates, for example, saw so little potential in the internet that he refused even to go to conferences about it. 1995, figured what you could do with it. This has been developed for 30 years within the public sector at public expense, and it was handed over to private power, and it's now considered, kind of like the leading edge of the economy. How did that happen? Well, answer is nobody knows. No one knows how the decisions were made to commercialize the internet. It was done somehow, you sort of little, hints and bits and pieces here and there, but it was not a public decision, and it was, you don't exactly know who made it. It again has enormous effects on life, but secret. Well, that's the way, the executive and parliamentary branch of the government work. In a way more important than this is that private power sets the conditions within which policy is made, no matter who's in charge. Standard way of referring to it in the economics literature is that global capital markets have veto power over government policy. That's a little too abstract. A global capital market sounds like some kind of, abstract institution that couldn't be controlled. But global capital markets means the institutions in whose hands the capital is concentrated. So we're back to the same nexus of mostly by now financial and industrial corporations. That's capital markets to an overwhelming extent, and yes, they do have veto power over policy. Investors and Yeah, can you?
Can people hear in the background?
Can't hear?
Yeah, I was afraid of that.
All right. Well, let me try to be closer to the mic if I can. Investors and increasingly speculators now constitute what some economists call a virtual Senate, a Senate that can veto what they consider irrational policy. Irrational policy means policy that is designed to help people, not profits. So, for example, social programs, health, education, labor rights, women's rights, various things like that, that's irrational. Efforts to stimulate the economy, improve labor bargaining power, redistribute income, whatever it may be. And that can be punished, in fact terminated, simply by withdrawing capital from the country. Huge. When there's $1.5 trillion circulating per day, totally overwhelming governments, the virtual Senate it can determine what policy will be, deviate from their decisions, and country goes down the tube. For the poorer countries of the world, that's just the virtual Senate has overwhelming power. But the same is true even for the rich countries. That was illustrated in the United States in 1992, when there was a little misplaced concern when Clinton came in that he might mean some of the things that he had said during the campaign. And of course, during the campaign, you have to appeal to voters and sort of say things they'll like and so on. And that concern was manifested very quickly in a very sharp increase in bond interest rates. They were driven up, which is a signal that the country is going to go down the tube, capital flow out of it, unless you shape up and ensure, for example, that there's no irrational federal spending, like for the population. You have to have federal spending to control, to socialize cost and risk, but not for the general population. And that was followed. That's what's called the New Democrats, like the old Republicans. Policy is set very clearly that way. The liberalization of capital has the effect of opening countries up to this veto power. And not surprisingly, liberalization of finance has quite consistently led to severe problems, often catastrophe, for the poorer countries. South Korea is a dramatic example. Had a huge and very impressive growth rate without historical precedent. It was compelled under U.S. pressure to liberalize its financial markets early in the 90s, and it very quickly went into a huge tailspin. The numbers indicate that it's coming out, but they conceal the fact that a lot of the economy is by now foreign owned, things that were picked up on a fire sale, basically. Well, that's the virtual Senate, which is able to set policy that way, no matter who happens to be sitting in one or another office, and they make sure the right people are sitting there, or else are bought off in the manner that I described and that you know about. These are major factors about the modern world, particularly since the early 1970s, when the global system was redesigned and reshaped so that it would have these characteristics, quite consciously, in fact. This is called neoliberalism, or it's called minimizing the state, but the terminology is misleading. As for neoliberalism, as I mentioned, it's not new, it's just the old double-edged market strategy with a few nuances that are different. There are some differences, like, for example, the huge role of uncontrolled and unregulated financial capital, which really is new. As for minimizing the state, that's misleading too. In the rich countries, the OECD countries, the 29 richest countries, the state expenditures have actually increased relative to GNP over the period of so-called minimizing the state. So Thatcherite England, for example, same when she left after 17 years as when she came in. But the distribution of what the state does has changed. It has cut back services for the general population and increased services for the wealthy. Well, that's not minimizing the state, it's changing the state. Furthermore, these so-called neoliberal countries, like, say, Reaganite America, are highly protectionist. The Reagan administration was the most protectionist administration in post-war U.S. history. It virtually doubled one or another form of protection in the interests of those groups that it serves, the private powers, the private tyrannies that dominate the internal society. And so matters continue. It's not new, it's been going on for centuries. Quite apart from these methods of controlling state policy, staffing the executive, buying Congress, setting the conditions within which policy is determined, the internal powers also control the doctrinal and information systems to an overwhelming extent. So they set the way people are supposed to think and the attitudes they're supposed to have. The mass media, point's obvious, doesn't have to be discussed. They simply are major corporations by now, not many of them, international, highly interlinked, huge. Not surprisingly, the picture of the world that they present is one that reflects the interests of their owners and also their market, which happens to be advertisers who have basically the same interests. Alongside the straight doctrinal institutions like media and schools and so on, there's also an enormous industry, public relations industry, primarily a U.S. creation, but now worldwide, and it's very clear about what it intends to do. You read industry leaders, now for 70 years, they explain that their goal is, I'll quote some characteristic phrases, to nullify the customs of the ages and impose a philosophy of futility on the population, a lack of purpose in life. They want to create wants, to create what they call fancied needs, invented needs, to concentrate human attention on the more superficial things that comprise fashionable consumption. If you can do that, if you can turn people into passive, hopeless, futile objects, they will then accept, maybe even welcome, the meaningless and subordinate lives that are left to them in a system in which decisions lie elsewhere. These campaigns fought by the public relations industry very consciously again, and they do talk about it so you can hear what they're thinking and describing. The campaigns, as they put it, to fight the everlasting battle for the minds of men and to indoctrinate them with the capitalist story while imposing a philosophy of futility and helplessness. These campaigns, they're always going on, but they take increasing passion at particular moments when there is a democratic upsurge among the general population. That happens typically after economic crises and wars. Those have a way of sort of concentrating people's attention on questions of justice and freedom, and it calls for a response. The United States is maybe the most free country in the world, and therefore, not surprisingly, this goes together, has the most dedicated systems of indoctrination and propaganda that correlates with freedom. If you're in a dictatorship where you have torture chambers and secret police, you don't really have to worry very much about what people think or what their attitudes are. But the more free the country is, the more you have to control the public mind. And that's strikingly true in the United States, the home of the public relations industry and of some sort of thought control, effective thought control. Britain maybe second. Right after the First World War, there was the First World War was an example. Right after the First World War, there was great pressure to increase extend the franchise, extend voting to workers' rights and industrial democracy were on the agenda, and that called forth a reaction. The reaction was that's when the public relations industry really grew to become a major industry. And its leaders explained that their goal was to regiment the minds of the masses, just as an army regiments their bodies, and nullify the customs of the ages and so on. Corresponding alongside the growth of the public relations industry, there was a very harsh repression. The Red Scare, Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare. The concern at the time was that the masses intend to become king, I'm quoting, and therefore we must regiment their minds, manufacture consent, ensure that they become passive and obedient and don't have funny ideas about controlling their own fate. Same thing took place in England at the same time. The always ruling Conservative Party recognized that it was not going to be able to maintain control in a period of greater democracy and participation, and therefore its internal documents have recently been made public. They followed the same course. They determined that they must carry out what they called political warfare in order to control the population now that they couldn't be just marginalized and dismissed. Both in England and the United States, the propaganda systems drew from the wartime experience. Both England and the United States had very effective state propaganda agencies during the First World War, and the lessons that were learned there were taught to those who were concerned with regimenting the minds of the masses in the period that followed. And in fact, the leadership of the public relations industry and the counterpart in England came straight out of these state propaganda agencies, including well-known figures. Walter Lippman, for example, who was the kind of major figure in American journalism. Edward Bernays, who was a Kennedy, Woodrow Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberal, lived in Cambridge, highly respected liberal, and was the leading figure in the American public relations industry and others. The same thing happened after World War II. After World War II and the Depression, there was a kind of a radical democratic surge all around the world that required a response. The response was, first of all, internationally, to undermine and destroy the anti-fascist resistance throughout most of the world and to restore traditional, largely discredited conservative rule that happened almost everywhere, and also a huge propaganda offensive, particularly in the United States, to beat back what business leaders called the hazard-facing industrialists in the rising political power of the masses. The scale and intensity of that propaganda campaign are quite astonishing and really worth looking at. There's recently some very good scholarly work on it. Same thing happened after the 1960s. The 1960s was another democratic upsurge, led to the same response. There was concern over what was called a crisis of democracy, title of an important book by the Trilateral Commission, mostly representing the liberal sector of international capitalism, I should say, the internationalist sector. Carter administration, for example, came out of that. They were deeply concerned with what they called excessive democracy of the 1960s, meaning usually marginalized sectors of the population, women, youth, minorities, working people, others who were usually quiet and don't make a fuss, tried to enter the political arena to put forth their demands. And that's an excess of democracy, has to be controlled. We can't have that. The American leading American participant, a professor at Harvard, Samuel Huntington, deplored the fact that it was no longer possible to do what Truman had done. Truman, he said, was able to run the country with the help of a few Wall Street lawyers and bankers, bit of an exaggeration, but sort of the point. And now that's becoming difficult because of the excessive democracy, which has to be beaten back. The crisis has to be overcome. And it was overcome in part, again, by repression, which was significant, and in part by a propaganda offensive, again, quite enormous on all fronts, and in this case, by redesign of the system of world order to narrow democratic choices very sharply. One primary mechanism for that was the liberalization of capital flows, enormous effect. That's the period we're now in. Well, crucial point, world orders are constructed, they don't just arise. They're constructed by a state-corporate nexus in the modern period, which dominates the economy, political life, doctrinal institutions, and has quite obvious goals, namely to enhance the interests and power of those who are leading parts of that system. That shouldn't surprise anyone, and in fact it's true. Well, one crucial task of the doctrinal system is to make it appear that all of this is done for the public good. And there's even a technical term to describe that. It's called the national interest. So it's all done for the national interest. Well, a moment's thought is enough to tell you that national interest has to be a term of propaganda, not of description. You take any society, inside it there are conflicting interests. There's some that are national, like, surviving, let's say. But when you get beyond the obvious, there are mostly conflicting interests. And in fact, there is even a technical term to describe the conflicting interests. They're called the special interests, which are opposed to the national interest. When you look at the special interests, it turns out they are, for example, working people, farmers, women, the young, the old, in fact, the population. That's the special interests. They're the special interests, and they're bad. Policy has to be insulated from the special interests. The way Walter Lippman put it, and he's a leading liberal intellectual, I'm not quoting from the right wing, he said we have to ensure that the responsible men who represent the national interest will be protected from the rage and trampling of the bewildered herd. That's everybody else, but the representatives of the national interest. And the national interest, of course, turns out to be the same narrowly selected sectors of power. You become a responsible man if you serve their interests, not if you serve other interests, like those are the special interests. Well, that's these are the sectors that are what James Madison nicely called the tools and the tyrants of government. They run it, they benefit from it, and they function for it. That's the state-corporate nexus serving the national interest. There are many dramatic cases of this. we know a lot about public attitudes from polls, for example, and quite consistently you find that public attitudes and the so-called national interest, that is, the policy that's instituted, are widely divergent. Now, that's true on issue after issue. Environmental protection, education, health, nuclear armaments, to take one that's current right now. On all of these issues, the public attitudes are over in one area, and the decisions made within the political system are in a different area. They are the national interest, but not the interest of the nation, at least not the combination of special interests who constitute the population. One of the most dramatic examples of that is the one that Charlie mentioned earlier, the so-called free trade agreements. NAFTA, the World Trade Organization agreements, the Uruguay round, which set that up, the next one that's coming along in November, the multilateral agreement on investments. All of these agreements, so-called free trade agreements, they're quite striking examples worth looking at closely of how public attitudes and policy diverge so sharply that the agreements have to be carried out mostly in secret, because just like the Telecommunications Act and others, because people won't like it if they find out about it, and that's understood. These are not free trade agreements. For one thing, they are not about free trade. As I mentioned, they are highly protectionist in many respects. They're designed to serve the special needs of powerful corporations, transnational corporations, which involves a mixture of protectionism and liberalization, complicated mixture. So they don't have to do with free trade, and they certainly are not agreements, at least if agreement refers to the general public. So case after case, turns out the public's opposed to them. NAFTA, for example, was an agreement supposedly between Mexicans, Canadians, and people of the United States. The Canadian population was strongly opposed. In the United States, the population remained opposed, which is quite striking because commentary was almost totally enthusiastically in favor of it. Critical voices were virtually not allowed. Nevertheless, public opposition remained a majority. In Mexico, you can't really tell. It's a dictatorship, so you don't know much what people thought. But there certainly were huge demonstrations and protests, and businessmen protested, farmers, all sorts of people. So it's a fair guess that in all three countries, the public was strongly opposed. And in order to deal with that fact, it was necessary they tried to ram it through in secret. The original plan was to pass it without discussion, did break through at the last minute, and then interesting developments took place. It turned out that the mass media simply would not allow a voice to critics. The labor movement, for example, was critical of NAFTA, not in the way that you were told. It was not opposed to a North American trade agreement, free trade agreement. It was opposed to this particular version of it, which was an investor rights agreement, and suggested alternative versions. Well, they had a detailed program that was never discussed. As far as I could figure out, it never even made the media. There was a lot of discussion of the labor movement, mostly from the left-wing attack dogs of the media, who are usually assigned this task, like Anthony Lewis of the New York Times, who condemned what he called the crude, unenlightened labor movement with its brutal tactics and so on, but never told you what they were proposing. That would have been improper. The Office of Technology Assessment, which is Congress's own research branch, now disbanded because they were giving too much useful information. But the Office of Technology Assessment gave an independent analysis. Turned out to be very much like that of the labor movement. They opposed this particular version of NAFTA, saying it would be harmful to the people in all three societies, though beneficial to investors, and called for a different version. Well, as far as I could tell, their critique was never permitted expression. In fact, nothing was permitted expression, which is remarkable in a complicated, very open society like this. The day after NAFTA was passed, the New York Times ran its first story analyzing what the effect was likely to be for the New York region. And of course, they were very upbeat about it. They said it would be marvelous, it would be great for the chemical industry and the publishing industry and the PR industry and Wall Street and so on. But then sort of down in the article, they said there's also going to be some losers. You know, nothing's perfect. The losers will be women, minority, and unskilled workers, which happens to be about 70% of the workforce. In other words, the losers will be the population, but the winners will be the selected sectors that they represent. Well, you know, you had to really read the article carefully even to find out that much, but just to make sure that nobody found out even that much, it was the day after the thing was passed. That's pretty typical. The population's against it, and you therefore have to keep them marginalized. The same about just when fall 1998, I guess, 97, there was an attempt to pass what's called fast-track legislation. Again, it was an attempt to pass it in secret. Fast-track legislation gives the executive, the president, the right to make trade agreements without any congressional oversight. Congress is allowed to say yes or no, you know, when it's presented, meaning yes. Again, there was an effort to ram it through in secret, but again, it broke through. And there was a lot of public pressure, so much in this case that they couldn't pass it. This is called a free trade proposal, but it doesn't have anything to do with free trade. It has to do with democracy. The most passionate advocate of free trade would be opposed to fast track if they happen to be in favor of democracy. The question is, will the arrangements be settled without public exposure? That's what fast track is about. The Wall Street Journal, which was naturally strongly in favor of it, deplored the fact that it seemed to be impossible to get it through. They attributed that to what they said that critics of the fast-track legislation have what they called an ultimate weapon. The ultimate weapon is that the population's against it. And somehow you couldn't keep that ultimate weapon sheathed, much as they tried. So that didn't get through. Rather strikingly, during the fast-track debate, which did finally take place, there was no mention of what was the crucial issue, namely the multilateral agreement on investments. Which was right in the background, and that's the main thing they wanted fast track for. But that was not mentioned. And that's a very interesting story in itself. I don't have time to go into the details, but I'll mention some of the facts. The multilateral agreement on investments had been negotiated for 3 years, but in secret. It was known, like it was no secret to the participants. For example, the business sector knew all about it. The U.S. Council for International Business, which is the coordinating group for businesses with international concerns, they'd actually published a monograph about it in January 1996, perfectly aware of it. Media were aware of it. Everybody was aware of it except the public. And the reason that they were kept in the dark was it was well understood that if they ever found out about it, there was going to be a howl, and it would be impossible to ram it through, which is indeed what finally happened. When it finally did break through in early 1998, after 2 years of secret negotiations, Business Week had an article headlined, "The Most Explosive Trade Deal That You've Never Heard Of," which is true. It was explosive, and you'd never heard of it. The reason you'd never heard of it was because of its terms, which were known to be unacceptable. Well, the aftermath of that, no time, if you'd like, I'll run through some of it. There's a lot in print. But in fact, it was an extraordinary giveaway of power to private investors, private corporations, to the detriment, extreme detriment of democratic rights and human rights generally, across the board. When it finally did break through grassroots activism and very good use of the internet, which is still open, fortunately, may not be for long, the public reaction was so great that the OECD, the rich countries, had to back off. They could not pass it. And that led to total panic in business and media circles. The press condemned what they called the hordes of vigilantes who had swarmed down upon the poor OECD, the rich countries of the world, and the corporations, and just overwhelmed them with their crazed tactics. business trade experts told the press that this disaster might mean that it's going to be hard to do, I'm quoting now, it's going to be hard to do deals behind closed doors than with rubber stamping by parliaments. It's going to be necessary to let the special interests enter, which is a total disaster. Those who were, the hordes of vigilantes were described as an unholy alliance of xenophobic hysterics, aid groups, unions, environmentalists, all crazed people who were somehow undermining the ability of the responsible people to do trade deals in secret and have them rubber stamped by parliaments. Well, that was backed. They had to back off of that, but it's seeping back in other ways. The November World Trade Organization meetings will be an effort to try to introduce some of the aspects. Others are coming in elsewhere. The way the propaganda system handles these things is very revealing. A couple of weeks ago, there was a front-page story in the New York Times about the terrible things that are happening in Europe. The headline was Heartburn, Fearful Over Future, Europe Seizing on Food. And it described how these crazy, irrational Europeans who are frightened about an American supremacy are demanding, I'll now quote, they're demanding the right of people to feed themselves as they choose, the right to, their opposition to letting Monsanto and McDonald's impose foods that we eat and the seeds that we grow. They were even going so far as to call for a tax on international financial transactions to help the world's poor and to fight social inequality, known as the Tobin tax in the economics literature, tax to try to cut back very destructive, speculative transactions. Well, these are really pretty awful things. The article describes it as a kind of collective madness, virulent anti-Americanism. It's described as the prickly French soul, the widespread fear of trampling with nature, collective madness with uncommon virulence, just an awful hysteria over the world. I mean, how can people actually claim to want to have a right to decide what food they should eat or what seeds they should plant, or to think about imposing constraints on the speculative financial transactions that are ruining the economy? The press quite reflexively takes the position that this must be insane, and there's even a proof. After all, Monsanto and McDonald's say so. What better proof could there be? Anyone who questions that must be mad. That's typical and striking. Even worse, it points out that the rot is spreading. This collective madness is no longer simply left totally in Europe. It's spreading to the United States, even though doctrinal controls are much more rigid here. But people are beginning to be worried about these crazy things like choosing what foods they'll eat and so on. The ultimate weapon is getting harder and harder to control. Well, let's move to another plane and talk about how world order has been shaped and formed, and the questions of sovereignty that are part of the constitutional order that is being instituted mostly in secret. There was a time right after the Second World War when a system of world order was very consciously designed, clearly and consciously designed. It had three basic elements. The United Nations was established, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was agreed on, and there was an international economic system established called the Bretton Woods system. Now, these three were closely related, an integrated whole. They all had to do with democracy and human rights in various ways. And they're all under challenge. The United Nations was based on the fundamental principle that the threat or use of force against any state is illegitimate. So against aggression is out. This is part of the decolonization of the imperial world. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights declared at least the rights of people, and two major categories, civil and political rights and social and economic rights. And the Bretton Woods system was based on the principle of stable currencies and capital controls. Those are its fundamental principles, designed primarily by the United States and Britain. The issue of sovereignty entered in all of these aspects of the system of world order. It's coming up for, this is a kind of a catchword of 1999, but it's being presented very misleadingly. It's worth thinking through carefully just how these things interact and what sovereignty means. Well, with regard to the United Nations and the UN Charter, it's obvious what it means. State sovereignty is protected from aggression. The threat or use of force in international affairs is ruled out except under very special circumstances. With regard to the Bretton Woods system, the international economic order, the question of sovereignty also arises, crucially, but it's implicit. It's not stated in so many words. It's implicit but crucial. And it's crucial in the way that I've already discussed. It was understood by the framers of the international economic system that free movement of capital is going to undermine sovereignty. That is, it is going to undermine democratic rights and social and economic rights, civil and political and democratic and social and economic rights, for exactly the reasons that I described. And I was just quoting people like Harry Dexter White and John Maynard Keynes, who constructed the system, and there's not much debate about this. Namely, if capital is mobile and unconstrained and unregulated, you will have a virtual Senate which will fix their own policies, overriding the interests and concerns of the public, which can be realized through government policy to the extent that the state is democratic. So you allow capital mobility, and you undermine democratic rights and social and economic rights. Policies are made by the virtual Senate, who can simply destroy a country by depriving it of capital. This is well understood. There is nothing controversial about this. One of the leading, let me just quote a leading and very respected A History of the International Financial System by Barry Eichengreen, one of the leading international economists and specialists on this. He points out, as many other people do, that the current phase of so-called globalization is rather like the system pre-World War I in gross measures. There's nothing radically new in human history, although there are big differences. However, and he points crucially to one of the differences. Pre-World War I, he says, a government policy had not yet been politicized by universal male suffrage and the rise of trade unions and parliamentary labor parties. Therefore, the costs of the kind of financial rectitude that's demanded by the virtual Senate, they could be transferred to the general population, who couldn't do anything about it. They'd have to pay the costs. Pretty much what happens today to third world countries under structural adjustment programs imposed by the IMF, meaning the US. The population pays the costs, they're transferred to them, investors are happy. Pre-World War I, you could do that almost everywhere because democracy was so limited. By 1945, he points out, that was impossible. There had been an increase in democratic participation in parliamentary labor parties, unions, other popular groups. Therefore, he says, limits on capital mobility substituted for limits on democracy as a source of insulation from market pressures. Yes, exactly right. That's what the Bretton Woods system was about. It was reflecting the fact that there was a need to protect democracy and social and economic rights, civil and political and social and economic rights, which meant a way of insulating governments from market pressures, which was what the Bretton Woods system was all about. Now that has a corollary. Namely, when you eliminate the limits on capital mobility, you deregulate capital, you liberalize capital flows, you also you are reinstituting limits on democracy and undermining social programs, social and economic rights, and attacking the fundamental principles of the Universal Declaration. And that's, in fact, the period that we're in right now. In the early 1970s, that's exactly what was done. First the United States and then the other major countries eliminated the controls on financial flows with enormous effects. One is what I mentioned. There's been an astronomical increase in financial flows, and mostly speculative. In 1970, about 90% of foreign exchange transactions were connected to the real economy. It's like trade and investment. Now it's maybe 5% out of a vastly greater flow. It has also changed the international economy quite substantially. Since the early 70s, it's been a period of much slower growth worldwide, a few exceptions here and there, but pretty generally worldwide, lower growth of productivity, enormous power of financial institutions, a huge inequality, both internationally and domestically. In the United States, the richest country, and the one that largely instituted this, we see that very clearly. In the United States, not only has inequality grown enormously back to maybe the 1920s, but most of the population has either stagnated or declined. Income, real wages are lower than they were in the 1970s. Poverty levels are higher than they were right throughout the 70s. There's a sector of the population that's doing great, including the people who write the articles. That's why you read about the fairy tale economy. And they always talk about the same thing, namely the stock market. Therefore, it's worth recognizing that about 1% of stocks, 1% of the population holds about half the stocks, and 10% of the population holds most of the rest. Stock is limited stock ownership elsewhere, but it's very highly concentrated in the top 10%, in fact, the top 1% or even 0.5% of the population. So for them, it's really a fairy tale economy. You go to the second decile, the next 10%, the 80th to 90th percent in wealth, they actually lost net worth in the period up to the last statistics through 1998. Net worth means assets minus debt. So they actually declined in the 10%. For the rest of the population, this rather low recovery, slow recovery of the last 8 years, long but slow historically, it has been unique in the sense that they have just barely recovered the position that they were at the peak of the last business cycle. There was a front page story about this in the New York Times a couple of days ago, pretty upbeat, about how finally the majority of the population was beginning to see something for them coming out of this fairy tale economy. But if you look closely, based on census figures, what it pointed out was that for household income had reached the level of 1989. Finally, that's after 10 years of 8-9 years of recovery. Finally recovered the level that it was in 1989, and much below what it was in the 1970s. And that's misleading because it's with many more hours of work. In fact, the average work week, according to the Census Bureau, is an incredible 60 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. For those of you who know any labor history and remember the tremendous struggle for a 40-hour week and see what's happened to that, the average family is putting in a couple of months more work per year than they were doing 20 years ago to try to keep stagnant or even declining incomes. Well, that's the result in a rich country of these policies. In poor countries, it's been a complete disaster. These are, again, decisions, choices. They don't have to be made this way. These are some of the connections between two of the pillars in sovereignty. The Bretton Woods system protected sovereignty so as to protect democratic rights and social and economic rights. As it's declined, so have those rights declined. Let's turn to the third pillar, the Universal Declaration. Well, here the story is complicated and mixed. It's not the way it's discussed here. The Universal Declaration requires sovereignty to permit social and economic and civil and political rights to be exercised. They cannot be exercised in a democratic system unless that system is insulated from foreign attack, either forceful attack by violent intervention or market attack, by liberalization of breakdown of the Bretton Woods system. There is, however, a real tension between the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Charter. The Charter protects the sovereignty of states. The Universal Declaration protects the rights of individuals, and they can be in conflict if a state is violating the rights of individuals. That's a real tension, which has been there since the beginning, and it's in that space that the question of so-called humanitarian intervention arises. Should there be a right to overcome sovereignty in order to save the rights of people? Big issue in 1999, and very misleadingly discussed. For one thing, because the Universal Declaration also requires sovereignty, as I mentioned. But the real point is that the concept of humanitarian intervention is highly problematic. It's very doubtful that the category even exists. If you look over the historical record, it's extremely difficult to find any genuine example of the use of force for true humanitarian ends. Sometimes had humanitarian consequences, but they weren't the goals. Furthermore, the World Court actually ruled on this in 1949 and made a very simple and obvious point. It ruled against humanitarian intervention on the grounds that humanitarian intervention will be reserved for the most powerful states. They're the ones who will decide when intervention is legitimate and how to do it, and they'll design the pretext. So it's just restoring imperialist rule. That judgment is plausible, and it's held in most of the world. Well, how does discussion about this work in the United States? Here it's kind of interesting. With regard to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the first aspect, the fact that it requires the protection of sovereignty in order for human rights to be exercised, that's almost never discussed. And there's a good reason for that. For one thing, the U.S. is the most powerful state, and therefore it will determine where forceful intervention can take place and why, and it can be assured that whatever it does will be hailed as humanitarian because there's a disciplined intellectual class, so they'll call it humanitarian, whatever it is. Secondly, the virtual Senate dominates U.S. policy making, and they're opposed to the Universal Declaration. They're opposed to economic and social rights and democratic rights. So if there's an attack on sovereignty, they're all in favor of it. So that's not discussed. Thirdly, the United States itself strongly opposes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's not a topic discussed much here. But the United States has been a leader of the so-called relativist critique of the Universal Declaration. It flatly rejects the social and economic rights, which are an integral part of it. These are been called by U.S. leaders a letter from Santa Claus, or preposterous, or dangerous incitement, and so on. The U.S. does not ratify the conventions enabling the implementation of these rights. The most dramatic case is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's been ratified by every country in the world except two. One is Somalia, which doesn't have a government, so it can't ratify it. The other is the United States, which doesn't ratify it because it doesn't accept it. And this generalizes quite broadly. So for these kinds of reasons, the first relationship between the Universal Declaration and sovereignty is never discussed. The fact that the Universal Declaration requires sovereignty for the rights to be implemented. As for the second, that turns out to be highly nuanced. There's a lot of talk, particularly this year, about the right of humanitarian intervention, but the U.S. obviously does not support humanitarian intervention to guarantee social and economic rights, because in fact it opposes those rights. nor to guarantee democracy, because it very often opposes democracy and in fact uses violence to prevent it. Nor does the United States support forceful intervention to prevent atrocities. Well, again, for good reasons. The U.S. is often implementing the atrocities. In fact, it's been condemned by the World Court for that, only country to have been condemned. And this has nothing to do with Cold War. It goes on right into the 1990s, after the Cold War. So during the 1990s, the worst human rights violator in the Western Hemisphere is Colombia. Atrocities in 1998 alone in Colombia were approximately almost identical to Kosovo, according to the State Department. And in Colombia, it's year after year. It's not just 1 year. They're the worst human rights violator in the hemisphere, and the human rights violations, again, just going back to the State Department reports, are attributable to the paramilitaries and the military, who are closely linked to them, about 80% according to the State Department. So what does the U.S. do? Well, it arms them. It has been especially under Clinton, it's been increasing the flow of arms to those accused of the atrocities of a Kosovo level. That's post-Cold War, nothing to do with Cold War. There's a drug war pretext, which nobody believes, if they're paying attention. Let's take an even more dramatic case, Turkey. Some of the worst ethnic cleansing of the 1990s happens to be within NATO. Not next door to NATO, but within NATO, namely in Turkey. In the mid-1990s, that's led to about 2 to 3 million refugees, destruction of 3,500 villages, about 7 times Kosovo, and maybe 30, 40,000 people killed. Why is that happening? Well, because the U.S. is supporting it. 80% of the arms come from the United States. As the atrocities escalated through the 90s, U.S. aid escalated, including advanced armaments, jet planes, napalm, tanks, military training, and so on. But that's okay. That's good atrocities, good ethnic cleansing, because we're doing it. And obviously nobody's going to intervene to stop that. There's a rather dramatic illustration of this last April. Last April, remember, there was a huge, great euphoric discussion about the new era of humanitarianism that we're entering, a new era in human affairs. The enlightened states are going to bring peace and justice to everyone, disregarding old musty notions like international law and sovereignty and so on. Right in the midst of this, NATO had its 50th anniversary in Washington, late April. And it was all under the somber shadow of ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, right? Terrible thing, got really upset and so on, and we can't let this happen right nearby NATO, an area which is where the West is responsible and so on. I couldn't find a mention of the fact that some of the worst ethnic cleansing, far beyond anything attributed to Miloševic in Kosovo, was going on within NATO. Not across the border, under the jurisdiction of the European Union, and the European Court of Justice, which was regularly handing down condemnations, and happening because the leader of the enlightened states was pouring armaments in to make sure that the atrocities increased. Try to find a word mentioning that fact. That requires remarkable discipline. Well, let's turn to a final question about this. Is it true that there was one unique exception in history to the commitment to undermine the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to limit democracy and so on? Is there one exception, namely Kosovo? Is that really the case, as we were told? Well, it'd be pretty surprising if there was one inconsistency in history. And if you look closely, there was no inconsistency. The story that we were told, and is repeated over and over again, is that in Kosovo, the United States and NATO had to intervene to stop ethnic cleansing, and that was just a moral imperative. Well, even just the barest look at the uncontroversial facts shows that that cannot possibly have been the case. The reason is that the massive ethnic cleansing and atrocities were a consequence of the bombing, not a cause of it. They followed it. So therefore, the bombing couldn't have been undertaken to prevent the atrocities that followed it as a consequence, and in fact as a predicted and anticipated consequence. The commander of the NATO forces, Wesley Clark, as the bombing began, told the press, look, it's entirely predictable, his words were, it is entirely predictable that the bombing is going to lead to a very sharp escalation of atrocities. A couple of weeks later, he was interviewed on British television, BBC, and asked how the NATO was reacting to the ethnic cleansing. He said, look, the NATO bombing was never undertaken to stop ethnic cleansing. He's only the commander of the forces. Furthermore, if you look at the facts, you see that that's exactly the case. Kosovo wasn't a pretty place prior to the bombing. In fact, it was rather like Colombia the preceding year. Figures are about the same. And the reasons about the same. At the time when the bombing started, the UN High Commission on Refugees, which takes care of refugee flows, it's the agency responsible, had no registered refugees outside of Kosovo. People had left and come back and so on. It had been an ugly place, but there were no registered refugees. The first registered refugees were 3 days after the bombing started. About a week after the bombing started, they started giving a daily accounting because there were so many refugees being driven out. Within a couple of weeks, it had reached these horrendous figures, 700,000, 800,000. But that's after the bombing, and a consequence, and a predicted consequence. Furthermore, Clinton and Blair, especially Clinton, had made sure that there would be no preparation to take care of the anticipated flow of refugees. A little noticed fact is that they defunded the UN High Commission on Refugees. They had to cut their staff 25% in January because the U.S. was refusing to pay. This is at a time when they're preparing to bomb with an anticipated flow of refugees. To say that we intervened there in order to stop ethnic cleansing is outlandish. I mean, quite apart from the fact that we were not only supporting, but decisively supporting massive ethnic cleansing and atrocities right within NATO itself at the same time, at a far higher level. To overlook these facts and to talk about a new era of humanitarianism in which the enlightened states are going to bring justice, that requires a very disciplined, educated class. And they did it without a whisper. They got into trouble a couple of months later because of the next big issue, East Timor. In fact, right through the 1999, the atrocities in East Timor were beyond the level of Kosovo. About 3,000 to 5,000 people were killed before the August 30th referendum. After, it got much worse. That's double the level of Kosovo, 4 times the level if you take account of population. How did the U.S. react? Well, the way it's always reacted, namely by supporting the Indonesian generals. The reaction was, the U.S. official position was, it's Indonesia's responsibility and we don't want to take it away from them. So in the case of East Timor, we have to respect sovereignty zealously, even though there is no sovereignty, because it doesn't exist. East Timor, the only right that Indonesia had in East Timor is the right that Nazi Germany had in occupied France. They invaded and conquered it. That's their sovereignty. They were ordered out by the United Nations, but the U.S. ensured that that would be ineffective and said so. It was condemned by the World Court. The U.S. disregarded it. The U.S. has been supporting it all the way through. Well, that's their right. There's no sovereignty apart from that. And that non-sovereignty must be zealously protected right at a time when we're praising ourselves for our newfound dedication to defending human rights and overriding sovereignty. Well, it's a little hard to put all this together, and in fact, commentators were beginning to have trouble with it. After the referendum, the atrocities escalated, and at that point, it really became hopeless. The Clinton administration was under tremendous pressure, domestically and internationally at this point, to do something. Congress, the Senate, had unanimously voted back in June to restrict financial aid to Indonesia if they continued to carry out atrocities in East Timor. Nobody paid any attention. I don't even think it was reported. The Clinton administration, it finally broke through to the press, and the press pointed out, New York Times, that the Clinton administration had made the calculation that Indonesia, a rich country of 200 million people with plenty of resources, was important, and a poor, impoverished country of 800,000 people just wasn't important. Yeah, that's accurate, and that's been accurate for 25 years, and it's been accurate right through the period of this alleged enlightenment. But at this point, by mid-September, it was becoming very hard to continue. Too much pressure, especially from Australia, which was fuming about it. Finally, the Clinton agreed to make some minor gestures, very minor gestures. Look what happened. Within 24 hours, the Indonesian generals pulled out. All that was required, no military intervention was required. All that was required was for the boss to tell them it's over, And they changed course 180 degrees virtually overnight. That indicates the latent power that's been there all along and the culpability. However, U.S. policy continues. Right now, there are about 500,000 people unaccounted for. Nobody knows where they are. Hundreds of thousands are probably up in the mountains, probably starving to death. Have you read anything about airdrops of food by the U.S. Air Force? I mean, there is one Air Force in the world that has the logistic capacity to drop food to these people. I mean, it has the capacity to attack civilian targets in countries we want to attack. Can do that easily enough. Can't drop food to starving people. Do you even see the issue discussed? No, because it is not our job to protect hundreds of thousands of people who are starving to death in a country that we've destroyed by supporting a murderous attack on it that's wiped out a third of the population over 25 years. Not our job. Somebody's got to pay for the Australian forces, later the UN forces who finally were allowed in after the U.S. told the Indonesians to call it off. Who's paying for it? Well, Japan just offered $100 million. Portugal's offering money. How about the United States? Not a cent. In fact, the U.S. is even refusing to pay its share of these costs of the civilian administration in Kosovo. Well, you sort of read closely, you can find little details about this here and there. That's that's the exception, the right of sovereignty and humanitarian intervention. The whole story is much more complex, as I described, and that's never discussed. Well, a lot more to say about all of this, but way over time already. So let me just end where Charlie began. What's taking place is not laws of nature. These are human decisions. We can let them happen this way if we want. We can accept the philosophy of futility that's preached by the doctrinal system, or we can decide to take our fate into our own hands, and bearing in mind that given our power and privilege, our fate is also the fate of the world and the fate of future generations.
Before you leave, two things. You can do something right now to lift your own spirits after hearing this sober assessment of the state of the world. We have in the back of the church, as you leave, some donation boxes for the people of East Timor. Noam has been speaking about East Timor for 20 years. It's not a new genocide. We have a responsibility that goes back a very long time. We hope that you'll do something to make yourself feel better and to help those people by making a donation at the back of church as you leave. Now we're going to have a short discussion period. Noam is going off to Central America very early tomorrow morning, so we're not going to keep him very long. There's a lot to talk about. If you have a question, and it's hard to imagine that people sitting in this room would not have questions about what Noam has been talking about, we want to give you a chance to do it. So if you can line up at the mic and keep your question at 30 seconds or lower, please. Yes, let's start out. And please think about the people of East Timor as you leave the auditorium.
Can you hear me? Thank you. Good stuff. Thank you for speaking up and encouraging us to follow up. I have a quote here from the U.S. President. I was going to read it very quickly. I see in the near future a crisis approaching that at a nerve speed causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. As a result of the war, corporations have been enthroned in an era of corruption in high places will fall, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign until all wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. I feel at this moment more anxiety for the safety of my country than ever before, even in the midst of the war. Can I get a quick guess which U.S. president said that quote? Abraham Lincoln. Yes, Abraham Lincoln in 1864, 135 years ago. I would just like you to relate today's Republicans in the terrible campaign that had before us with the roots of the Republican Party, which was abolitionist and concern for corporate power.
It's hard to remember, but at the time of Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party were even opposed to wage labor. They regarded wage labor as not very different from chattel slavery. Maybe it's temporarily legitimate as a way to become free, but the idea that a person should be forced to rent themselves in order to survive was strongly counter to the principles of the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln in particular. And even editorials in the New York Times, hard as it is to believe, back around 1870. We've come a long way since then.
I had a couple of questions, but I just put it on one. What is your opinion? Do you agree or could you briefly comment on the idea propounded by some other cultural critics, such as Neil Postman, that visual media are antithetical to serious discussion, that their very nature is such that it is impossible to have a serious discussion?
Are visual media antithetical to serious discussion? I'm not a good person to comment on that because I don't know a thing about the visual media and can't stand subjecting myself to them. But they certainly are not the obvious medium for entering into serious discussion, particularly the way they're organized. It doesn't have to be like that. So outside the United States, I know this from personal experience, the national television is, or has been until recently, less so than in the past, but still is, open to very serious discussion. So on primetime television in most countries, in national network, you have lengthy interviews, discussions, debates, so on crucial issues, on issues ranging from issues of the day to cultural and scientific issues. The United States does not have that. We have commercial media which are geared to the interests of their owners and their advertisers. And that is primarily just what I quoted from them. I was quoting from them, imposing a philosophy of futility, creating wants that people don't have, ensuring that they somehow become passive and obedient, not questioning and so on. Sure, that's not conducive to serious discussion, but I doubt that that's really inherent in the medium. I think that's a property of the way it's organized, run, and controlled.
My name is Alex King, and I heard Margaret talks about how ideologies become so powerful that they almost become an identity. It's hard for me to believe this hasn't happened. The system of domination, capitalism, there comes out, or the ideas of utility, or those false needs. I don't understand how we would be able to take the power or full power back ourselves to decide ourselves what we feel is important or what we actually need. It seems that it's also its own entity. Would you agree?
Well, I don't think there is a major battle going on against popular democratizing tendencies, and popular pressures often win. I gave a couple of examples. Despite the enormous efforts to ram through the multilateral agreement on investments, which would have had a major effect on democracy and social rights, it was beaten back. It was beaten back by an aroused public, which had to avoid the media because they weren't offering an opening. So it did it in other ways: grassroots organizations, communication through the internet, all sorts of other means. And what happened there is quite striking. I mean, support for the multilateral agreement on investments was vested in the greatest concentration of power in world history. You know, the richest countries, states in the world, the international financial institutions, the corporate sector, and the corporate media were all 100% in favor of it. Who was against it? Well, the hordes of vigilantes, you know, these grassroots organizations who managed to mobilize enough people to beat them back. There's never been, I can't even think of a case where two forces were so unequally matched in power and yet the popular ones won. And it's not the only one. There's a reason for these campaigns, you know, to everlasting struggles to control the mind of men. It's because people are hard to control. That's what happened in the 30s and the 40s. It happened again in the 60s. Still going on today. There's plenty of opposition all over the place. At the World Trade Organization meeting in November, there's going to be plenty of protest. And those who are trying to ram through further non-agreements are very worried about it. Trying to get to undermine and, you know, marginalize the protests. There is absolutely no reason to subordinate oneself to these systems of power, and furthermore, there's no reason for them to exist. You know, there is no law of nature that says that the media, for example, or the whole doctrinal system, has to be in the hands of a few megacorporations who sell audiences to advertisers, with the goal of inducing a philosophy of futility and marginalizing people. It's your choice whether that's going to happen or not. It doesn't have to happen. No? It is not a law of nature that the airwaves, the spectrum is publicly owned. It's your property. You want to give it away to half a dozen megacorporations to brainwash you? Fine, do it. But don't think you're forced to do it. You're not.
You touched a little bit about Timor and Kosovo. I'd like to know if you have any kind of vision about some sort of humanitarian intervention that would be effective and that wouldn't have an underlying agenda, and or if you see that as possible today in an organization that exists, or if you see it possible in an organization that could be created.
Humanitarian intervention to protect the rights of people against brutal states is a good idea. I mean, I'm all in favor of it. However, it runs into the problems that I mentioned. One is the problem pointed out by the World Court 50 years ago when it ruled on this issue. In the way the world is constructed, this is going to be a weapon in the hands of the powerful to use as they want. And whatever they do is going to be called humanitarian by the court flatterers, you know, the educated classes. Well, you know, we can't wish that away. We can have a discussion in a philosophy seminar about humanitarian intervention, but in this world, that's the way it's going to work. And if you look at history, that's the way it has worked. As an interest, I have a book about this if you're interested. I think I saw copies outside, but I didn't go through try to run through the whole history, although someday I'd like to. But it's very hard to find a historical example of a genuine humanitarian intervention. By that, I mean one undertaken for humanitarian ends. There are interventions that had humanitarian consequences. So, for example, the Russian war against Germany had enormous humanitarian consequences. It closed down Auschwitz, but that wasn't the goal. That was a consequence, not the goal. Remember, the Russians fought almost all the war against the Nazis. And yes, they terminated the concentration camps. In the modern period, you know, post-Second World War period, there are a couple of cases of interventions that did have significant humanitarian consequences, mainly two. One is the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in December 1978, which kicked out Pol Pot and terminated the Khmer Rouge atrocities just at the point when they were peaking. That was a humanitarian intervention in the sense that the consequences were humanitarian, certainly not the goals. The goals were, in fact, defensive. Vietnam was under attack by Cambodia, so they actually were exercising the right of self-defense. But the consequences were humanitarian. Well, how did the United States react to that? It bitterly condemned what it called the Prussians of Asia. It imposed very harsh sanctions on Vietnam to punish them for the crime of having terminated the crimes of the Khmer Rouge. And it supported a Chinese invasion to teach them a lesson right away. That was the reaction. The other major post-war military action that had enormous humanitarian consequences was the Indian intervention in what was then East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, which again brought to an end enormous atrocities, millions of refugees, huge numbers killed, and so on. How'd the U.S. react to that? Very angrily. Sent the U.S. fleet to the Bay of Bengal to threaten India, threatened sanctions, real fury. The reason was apparently that they were fouling up some good photo ops that Kissinger was hoping to get on an unannounced trip to China through Pakistan. That's illustrative. The reaction to interventions that had humanitarian consequences, whatever their goals, has been very negative. On the other hand, to find a real humanitarian intervention, that's hard. Even a humanitarian intervention, one with humanitarian consequences the U.S. supported, is very difficult. And it's not because the U.S. is uniquely bad. In fact, it's probably the best of the states around. It's because it's uniquely powerful. And power happens to lead to very unpleasant consequences. So yes, it would be nice to have a method for humanitarian intervention to take place, but that's going to require real changes in world order.
Hi, I was wondering if we did achieve a fair world economy.
If we could achieve a world army, fair world army, like a UN force or something? What would the long-term effects of? Well, if it was a fair army, it would probably have invaded the United States a couple times. For example, let's just take...
He said a fair world economy.
Oh, a fair world economy. I'm sorry. What would the effect be on the United States? Well, it depends who you mean by the United States. If you mean the general population of the United States, probably be to their benefit. If you mean the sectors of concentrated power, it would certainly harm them. Why not? The system that has been instituted for the past 25 years has been quite harmful to the general population. Look, this is the richest country in the world. It has absolutely unparalleled advantages. Already in the 18th century, the United States was probably the richest country in the world. The quality of life standards, like, health and longevity and so on, in the United States in the 18th century were not attained by the upper classes in England until early in this century, let alone anyone else. Once the native population was exterminated, which is what happened, the country was free and open for exploitation. Huge resources, temperate climate, no enemies. The United States hasn't been threatened since the War of 1812, a huge amount of capital flowing in when it was needed, a huge immigrant flow of cheap labor when it was needed. This ought to be, by orders of magnitude, the richest and most privileged country in the world. It's not. It's kind of like other industrial countries and worse than many of them in some respects. For example, we have the heaviest workload in the world. People work harder here just to get by than in any other industrial country. That's outlandish. We have levels of poverty, especially child poverty, hunger, and so on, which are unknown in other industrial countries. England is sort of close, but we're way in the lead. Just the proportion of the population that's criminalized, tossed into prisons to try to get rid of them, is out of sight. In 1980, it was about the same as other industrial countries. Now it's maybe 5 to 10 times as high as other industrial countries. I mentioned some of the things about wages and incomes. This is disaster in a country that is unbelievably privileged. let alone what's going on elsewhere. Well, what would happen in a fair economy is, well, these things wouldn't happen. However, a concentrated power which benefits from them, the ones who are benefiting from the fairy tale economy, they'd be much worse off.
My name is Woodrow. Towards the latter half of the presentation, you mentioned the World War and relation to America. And I was wondering, what do you see the prospect of America revisiting, the world revisiting that time, given the international features of the capitalists
Yeah, I'm having a hard time. Could you come? I can't hear what's coming from that mic very well somehow, but not, at least not from where I'm standing.
I want to say we're just going to have one or two more questions.
Yeah.
As I understood the last question, it was whether there was a possibility that the United States might revisit or reignite a world conflict of World War and how do you think about
is
the
that correct? Yeah. Well, let me just tell you something about the world reaction to the war in the Balkans this spring. The reaction in the self-described enlightened states, you know, like us, full of self-praise and self-adulation, was that we're just marvelous. That was not the reaction elsewhere in the world. The reaction outside of the United States and most of Europe was fear, concern, and anger, even in U.S. client states, like, say, Israel, which is the most, U.S. client state par excellence. You read what military and strategic analysts were saying there, which was, actually, I quoted a lot of it in this book. It was quite to the point, and it was repeated in Egypt, in India, and, South America, all over the world. They saw what was going on in Yugoslavia as just another exercise of gunboat diplomacy, traditional European imperialism in a new guise, under the cloak of moralistic righteousness, I'm quoting, and they predicted, to get to your point, a reaction. They said, look, other countries in the world are simply going to have to create a deterrent, including a nuclear deterrent. They mostly predicted nuclear proliferation in order to create a deterrent to unconstrained U.S. power, which is even more dangerous because it's so self-righteous, and so little criticized internally. So they predicted an increase in nuclear weapons, an increase in regional groupings that will try to create a deterrent to U.S. power, and all of that is a recipe for conflict. I mean, throughout the world, countries are reevaluating their strategy of deterrence for self-preservation. I mean, right now, for example, the Russian and the Chinese fleets are carrying out their first ever joint naval exercises. These are countries that have been practically at war for, decades. Well, they're now concerned. The most pro-Western of the Russian leaders, Evgeny Primakov, about a year ago, even before the Balkans War, on a visit to India, called for what he called a strategic triangle, China, Russia, and India, as a counterweight to U.S. power. I mean, after the Balkans War, these concerns got much more intense. Just to give you one example that I don't think was reported in the United States, early in September, like around September 3rd approximately, President Jiang Zemin of China visited Thailand and gave a speech which was very, got a lot of publicity around Asia, Southeast Asia, in which he condemned what he called U.S. gunboat diplomacy and economic neocolonialism, and called for efforts by the Southeast Asian states and China to set up a regional security system to separate themselves from U.S. power. That was rather warmly received by Thai elites, who are very much linked to and subordinated to the United States. These are concerns all over the place. And it's very likely that nuclear weapons will proliferate, other modes of reaction will proliferate with all the dangers that brings. So yeah, I think it's very hazardous. I mean, for example, look, the refusal right now, as we're talking, they've essentially given up on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Well, that's not a great treaty, I should say. That treaty is very harshly condemned in places like India, even by critics of the nuclear programs. Sharp critics of the nuclear programs nevertheless condemn that treaty because it's a hegemonic treaty. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty preserves the power of the nuclear states, meaning primarily the U.S., and tries to prevent anyone else from having that power. There is a non-proliferation treaty, which the nuclear states signed, but completely hypocritically. The non-proliferation treaty requires good faith efforts on the part of the nuclear states to eliminate nuclear weapons. That's not happening. In fact, the opposite's happening. And that's known throughout the world. They don't talk about it much here, but it's known throughout the world. And in that context, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and others is not regarded as a great achievement. Nevertheless, it's sort of favored. And the U.S. is not going along with it because though we like to talk about how insignificant the sovereignty of others is, U.S. power has to be preserved against any threat, even non-existent threats. Has to be maintained as overwhelmingly dominant. Well, those are prescriptions for disaster. A nuclear world is probably going to lead to total destruction. You can't predict the time, but it's very likely to happen sooner or later. Quite apart from that, there are, I haven't barely mentioned environmental issues. I mean, we're just playing with disaster on refusal to deal with environmental problems that are growing and very serious, and may terminate human existence and a lot of other existence not too far in the future. And, these are issues that cannot arise. They cannot be serious issues within the limited market systems that we have. And they require collective decisions by, committed people through a democratic process which has been undermined. All of these are very serious dangers. They're not jokes. And war is one of them.
I'm going to wrap this up just to protect Carol.
And a little longer is okay.
Okay. We're going to do a couple more questions.
Because I talked too long. I got to be punished for talking too long.
Whether in the after the loss of Vietnam, whether in fact through the new economic order and the spread of multinational corporations to countries like Vietnam, will essentially the goals of Vietnam initially be established? That is, the United States will be able to dominate that world through a new form of economic violence?
Well, I have to say that I'm in a minority of people here who think that the U.S. won the war in Vietnam. In fact, I thought so back in 1969 and 1970 and wrote about it. The goal of the U.S. war in Vietnam was to prevent independent development in Vietnam, which would be what they called, a model that others might like to follow, what's called a virus that might infect others. And by 1970, that was out of the question. Indochina had been virtually wiped out by U.S. power, and the surrounding region, where they were afraid the model might spread, had been inoculated from the virus by murderous, brutal regimes that the United States had instituted and supported there. So, for example, in Indonesia, when General Suharto took over in 1965, the first thing he did was wipe out about maybe 500,000 or 1 million people, mostly landless peasants, and destroy the only mass-based political party in the country. And the U.S. and the West generally were totally euphoric. This was the greatest thing that had ever happened. The CIA described it as one of the great mass murders of the century, comparable to Stalin and Hitler. And it led to total unrestrained euphoria in the United States because it was insulating Indonesia from the threat of, the example of Vietnam. And that was pretty openly said. Liberals were talking about how this justified the war in Indochina because that war provided a shield behind which the Indonesian generals were able to cleanse their society. The same thing happened in Thailand, the same happened in the Philippines, and so on. The whole region was under the control of brutal killers. There was no danger that anything was going to spread, and furthermore, Indochina was destroyed. Okay, that's a victory. As far as U.S. policy was, basic U.S. goals were concerned, they'd been attained by 1970. I should say, incidentally, that the international business press basically agreed with this. The Far Eastern Economic Review, which is the major, business journal for Asia, by the early 70s, they were saying, to the United States, look, you guys are crazy. Why don't you just get out? You've won already, And I think that's correct. After that, the U.S. imposed extremely harsh sanctions against Vietnam to ensure that it would not recover. It has refused, of course, can't even conceive of its paying reparations for having destroyed the country. That's unimaginable. We don't pay reparations for things like destroying 3 countries and murdering 5 million people or something like that. Rather, we've tried to strangle them so that they'd never recover. And finally, they're in a position where to survive, they're going to integrate themselves into the international economic system that the U.S. is dominating, or maybe Japan is dominating, depending on how things work out. So yeah, that's, you just look at the relations of power. It's almost impossible for a country that is with such an imbalance of power to achieve its goals. Tomorrow morning I'm off to Nicaragua. In the 1980s, Nicaragua was a hopeful country. It looked like it was escaping from, a century of brutal control by gangsters and tyrants that the U.S. had either imposed or supported. And there's a lot of hope in the country. It was devastated. It's now one of the most hopeless countries in the world. In the Western Hemisphere, it's the second poorest country in the hemisphere, right after Haiti. Haiti's been the beneficiary of U.S. aid throughout the century, too, including murderous invasions. And the country's, there's just nothing there, People are on survival strategies, try to get by through tomorrow. There's a sector of extreme wealth, okay? That's why it's called an economic miracle, and everybody's, macroeconomic statistics are wonderful, but the future of the country is very dim. Right now, the country's half underwater. They can't recover. Anytime there's a heavy rain or a drought or something, it's so close to the edge, it's practically destroyed. Actually, the rain that's been going on probably isn't very different from Seattle. But in a country that's been wiped out by you and me, by U.S. power, it's on the verge of survival anyway. Anything goes wrong, it's the end. Well, those are imbalances of power. If they continue, the more powerful will win. But we have the capacity to change that. We happen to have the great privilege of being right at the center of power. What we do makes an enormous difference if we choose to do it. Nothing else can save people.
Can you hear better now?
Yes.
First of all, thank you for spending some time to talk to us this evening. My question is, if you could take a few minutes to comment on, one, what you think the principal interests of the OECD countries are in this round of WTO talks, and more importantly, to me anyway, is what you think is at stake for developing countries.
For the developing countries. So the question is, what are the policies of the OECD countries in the coming round of World Trade Organization talks in Seattle in November, and what's the future for the developing countries? Well, the OECD countries, they're not uniform, but their policies are primarily those of the United States and its close allies. They'll dominate. And the U.S. is pretty clear about what it wants. It wants to ram through something like the multilateral agreement on investments. That failed when it was public, when it became public, through the efforts of activist groups, became public. It was blocked, but they want to work it out in some other way. That is a tremendous investor rights agreement. If you go through the details, you probably know, but it grants corporations what's called the right of national treatment. That's supposed to be innocuous. After all, why shouldn't U.S. companies be treated like Mexican companies when they go to Mexico? But think about it for a second. Suppose a Mexican of flesh and blood came to New York and said, I'd like to have national treatment. How long would that last? Well, we don't have to talk about it. Flesh and blood human beings don't have those rights. Only tyrannies, private tyrannies, not only have the rights of persons, but they have rights that persons can't dream of having. These tyrannies are also granted the right to sue states. So, for example, there's actually the U.S. was sued by Venezuelan oil producers who claimed that the EPA regulations against some additives were interfering with their profits. Okay, under World Trade Organization rules, which are designed to have this consequence, they win. So therefore, the democratic, to whatever extent it's democratic, decision of people of the United States to be free from some additive they regard as dangerous is overridden by the needs of the corporation for profit. And that works both ways. The Ethel Corporation, which is U.S.-based, got Canada to back down under threat of suit because they were trying to bar use of an additive which is banned in most places in the United States and the world, which is probably carcinogenic. They didn't want it, but they have to because that's expropriating ethyl property under these rules. The World Trade Organization, the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, is going to extend that. There's now a water company in Southern California, I think it's Sun Water Company, is suing Ottawa, Canada, because the province of British Columbia is refusing to sell them water. Okay, although British Columbia, sends water to other parts of Canada. Okay, that's expropriation of the potential profits of the water company, which would like to take Canadian water and send them to Los Angeles so that rich people can fill their swimming pools. Well, okay, the system is set up to allow that, in fact, to require it. The investors are permitted to transfer assets freely, productive or financial assets freely. Populations can't say anything about it. They can disregard decisions of a country or a locality on things like consumer protection or preferential treatment for deprived localities or for women or for minorities or, in fact, consumer rights. I mean, almost anything you can think of. These are interferences with the rights of these private tyrannies to do anything they want. There's a long list of them. One primary agenda item of the World Trade Organization will be to get those through in some fashion so that people don't notice it, because when it came through in the MAI, they noticed it and had to back off. A crucial requirement that the United States is demanding is liberalization of finance, meaning other countries have to allow U.S. financial institutions to take over their banks and insurance companies and so on, which guarantees that they can't carry out any economic policies. I mean, all of the instruments that were used by today's rich countries to become rich have to be taken away from everyone else, like carrying out, economic development programs designed for internal needs. That has to be taken away. The only rights that are going to be permitted are the rights of transnational corporations, primarily but not entirely U.S., to do anything they feel like. For the developing countries, well, of course it's going to be a disaster. Liberalization of finance alone is a disaster for the reasons I was discussing, and it has led to those consequences. The U.S. is insisting on it. That's going to be a condition on getting any kind of aid or loans or access to international capital or whatever. These are we've already had 25 years of experience with this, and you couldn't figure it out in advance. You can see what's happened. And efforts are now underway to make it worse. About a year ago, there was concern, significant concern, among the rich and powerful that this system that they had designed was so dangerous it was going to blow up in their faces. So about a year ago, there's a lot of talk about, revising the financial architecture, and that's fancy stuff, meaning do something to cut down the dangers of financial liberalization and free speculative flow and so on. Well, now the situation's kind of eased up a little, so there isn't any imminent catastrophe, maybe 2 months from now. And the way planning works among economists and, the IMF and big thinkers and so on, If it isn't blowing up in your face now, then you don't worry about it. After it blows up in your face, you say, oh yeah, we got to change all our theories and do something. That's been the history for a long time. And that's sort of part of the nature of a partially competitive profit-making economy when your concern is for profit tomorrow, not what happens 6 months from now. So the efforts mild efforts to reconstruct the financial architecture have mostly declined. The serious efforts, like for example the Tobin tax, which I mentioned, or others, there's others, those are just off the agenda. U.S. will not allow them on. I mean, the U.S. went to the Clinton administration, went to the extent that there was the UN Development Program, one of the main UN agencies, had a major publication on the Tobin tax. This is a tax on short-term speculative capital flows to try to slow them down so that financial interactions will be directed to the real economy instead of to destroying the economy. There was a major publication on this with leading economists. They couldn't distribute it. The U.S. put enough pressure on them so they couldn't even distribute the book. Not many people know it outside of technical economists. They don't want these things to happen. Their interest is in serving the, by now, major financial institutions, and industrial corporations. And that's going to be the agenda at the World Trade Organization if people let it happen. There's going to be a lot of protests and efforts to undermine it. And we will see. It's a matter, again, it's a matter of choice, of prediction. Okay, last one.
A very, very quick question and a quick answer.
Okay.
But in Mexico, people of Mexico realize this. And because of that, they've created their own democratic space through civil society, through organizing at grassroots level, through solidarity movements for people who are marginalized. And so because of this, there's a real culture of democracy in Mexico that doesn't exist in the United States. And so my question is, tonight you've come to speak to a private elite university, and the people who graduate from this university will have the privilege of being part of the ruling class when they graduate. But the people of this university also have, I think, an honest dedication to social justice and to meaningful reform. And so these people will be in positions of power in the next 20, 25 years. Do you think that meaningful reform can happen from these positions of power inside the system, or is it going to have to happen outside of the system at a grassroots level as we see in Mexico?
Well, I don't think there's that much difference between Mexico and the United States in this respect. There's a lot of grassroots activism here, too. But the question was a very sensible one. I mean, can significant changes come through positions of power or through grassroots movement? Well, in a certain sense, they can't, in the long run, they can't come through positions of power. In the long run, they won't come through positions of power because significant changes will eliminate the positions of power. But in the shorter run, there's an interaction. Grassroots movements and activism, people inside the sectors of power who want to see constructive change, they work with each other and support one another. Now, that's true anywhere you look, including the media, for example. I mean, there are people inside the media who are very honest professionals who would like to report things that are getting suppressed and don't like what's happening. And to a certain extent they can do it, but they can do it more to the extent that they have popular support from outside. Furthermore, the popular organizations outside gain from their doing it inside. So they're kind of a symbiotic relationship. You support one another. And the same is true throughout. I mean, you can't just wish power structures away. That it takes struggle to get rid of them. And as long as they exist, what you can try to do is constrain them and humanize them to some extent. And that can be done to the inside insofar as there are pressures from the outside, which are mutually supportive. However, in the long term, one can, like I'm not giving laws of logic or anything, but my own opinion at least is that in the longer term, erosion of the systems of power and domination is crucial for significant change. And insofar as that's correct, the change isn't going to come from the inside in the long run, but we function in the short run.
Hi, this is Roger Leisner for Radio Free Maine. And you've been watching Noam Chomsky speaking at Boston College, Thursday, October 7, 1999. Recorded for Radio Free Maine by Roger Leisner. This talk is also available on audio tape. For a copy of this talk on either audio or video, please contact Roger Leisner, Radio Free Maine. Post Office Box 2705, Augusta, Maine 04338. Or call area code 207-622-6629. Radio Free Maine can be found on the World Wide Web. The address is radiofreemaine.com.